good afternoon, everyone, and thank you so much for being with us today. I'm Anne Bauer, the Research Associate at the Konrad Adenauer Foundation's office based in Beirut, and I want to welcome you all today to this special session and special conversation, really, I'll be having with three esteemed academics that are researching and working on Syria mainly. Basically, this conversation will take the form of an interview where I'll be asking the researchers to tell us a bit more about the main findings of a study that they've recently completed for the Konrad Adenauer Foundation. And the outcome is really a very comprehensive report that is titled Towards Peace Formation, Navigating the Impact of the Conflict on Syria's Ethnic, Religious, and Tribal Communities. And it looks at the time frame from 2011, the start of the Syria uprising, until the present. And as the title already suggests, the study takes a closer look at some of Syria's diverse communities, as well as related socio-political dynamics in the respective regions that they inhabit. The study does so by the means of 5 different critical case studies, each of which pertains to the expertise and long-standing research focus of the individual scholars who I have the honor to introduce to you. So with me today is Syrian-British scholar Dr. Rana Khalaf, who is a fellow at the Center for Syrian Studies at St. Andrews University, and she's specializing in local governance, peace, and state formation in Syria. Also with me today is Thomas McGee, PhD candidate at Melbourne Law School, and he's focusing in his research on legal and social dynamics affecting the Kurdish community in Syria. And last but not least, also with me today is Dr. Haian Dukhan. He's a British-Syrian scholar, lecturer in politics and international relations at Teesside University, and a research fellow at the Center for Syrian Studies at the University of St. Andrews. He's renowned for his research on intricate relationships between tribal networks in Syria and state politics. So welcome to the three of you, and thank you so much for being with me today. In regards to the forthcoming study that you have written, within the scope of the 5 case studies, you have looked at efforts of indigenous local communities and grassroots actors, like basically efforts they have made towards forming peace and resolving conflicts from below. And in addition to that, you have developed context-specific policy recommendations for international policymakers that can be derived from these 5 case studies, and those they take into account the needs of local communities in the different regions. So without further ado, I want to start our conversation and delve into some of the main findings of the produced research as presented by the experts who have written this study. So I want to start with a question that's truly kind of a framing question to Rana. Could you tell us a bit more about the logic of this report, especially in relation to the important concept of peace formation, which you have invoked in the study?
So first of all, thank you, Anne. Thank you, Cass, for your interest in this logic and for even discussing it with us early on and believing in it without, putting the exact terms on it. So the idea of peace formation, we're looking into peace formation and not civil society. And the idea of peace formation and peace and conflict studies came after much criticism about how, different actors perceive peace, about, peace from the top is peace building, peace from below is peace formation. The same with civil society, where we see in conflict situations, civil society becomes more of a conflict society. And again, about the differences between civil society in authoritarian context and in a more democratic context. So this idea of peace formation helps us capture this local agency, which reflects those efforts and processes at forming peace and resolving conflicts from below. By mobilizing indigenous, local, and grassroots actors in their own social, cultural, and religious and customary local governance settings. So in here, civil society might not look like the Western institutionalized civil society organizations. They may not be formal. They usually tend to take a very low profile, to work in the shadows just to protect themselves. For instance, they can take the form of IDPs, teachers, activists, working towards reconciliation and conflict transformation. So in the report, we see it through community members mobilizing for social cohesion in Sweden. And we see it through Christian groups countering sectarianism across Syria, and the IDPs informally promoting fairer housing, land, and property rights arrangements in Afrin, and as Arab Sunni teachers backing a non-ideolized education system in Idlib. So looking at this question about the impact of the conflict on these different communities, ethnic, tribal, and religious, we try to capture, what's happening on the ground and this agency, and to propose policy recommendations that are very locally relevant, but at the same time, we try to understand the trends generally. And to do this, and because of the complexity of the Syrian conflict, we follow three assumptions. The first one is that largely the conflict is about a struggle over power, rules, and resources by the government of Syria and opposing forces, all of which have exploited the pre-existing sectarian divides, leading to security dilemmas that feed into communal and territorial fragmentation. Now, we're assuming that this territorial fragmentation we see in Syria under different governance systems is likely to stay in a frozen conflict for the foreseeable future. That's an assumption. Another assumption we're building on is that the government of Syria is uncommitted to meaningful reform, and that's based on its track record of unwillingness to engage with political solutions. That we also acknowledge that regional and international forces have also blocked. So what do we do with this report? Instead of giving much more, generalized policy recommendations, we try to look at more viable recommendations, working from the bottom, looking at very localized solutions and localized interventions that span the political, technical, and financial support to these peace formation agents. And we recommended that this process be reflexive, intersectional, and contextual. But again, here we understand that there's only so much power that these local agents of peace have, and we do understand the structural issues, and we actually even cover them in the report, as will be reflected in case studies. So this is not to say that we suggest actually hybridizing it with more bottom-up approaches too, with international pressure on conflict parties. Thank you, Anne.
Great. Thank you, Rana, for your thoughtful answer. And in the report, you basically also challenge the framing of identity and community. So before we dive into the cases, maybe Thomas, you can explain to us a little bit more about what you mean with identity or community in the report.
Sure. Thank you so much, Anne. And absolutely. So building on what Rana's already mentioned, we found that in general, communities in Syria have often been framed as quite fixed and essentialized, in the sense that they've been presented as almost homogeneous blocks with particular political affiliations, and we understand that that's often a huge generalization or a simplification. So what we sought to do with this report was to take a more nuanced approach and look at how the various identities, be they ethnic, religious, tribal, or other, have overlapped in Syria, as of course they do elsewhere. But we felt in work on Syria that's often not very well reflected. Of course, identities and notions of community have evolved over time. They also vary from one place to another. So, for example, we felt that a Druze living in the Swede heartland is going to have a markedly different experience from a Druze living in the suburbs of Damascus, or likewise a Kurd living in the northeast of the country will have under de facto Kurdish control will have a very different experience to a Kurd living in Damascus, in the capital. So ultimately, we've sought to move away from this essentialized minority-majority framing that's been quite dominant in some international analysis of Syria. We therefore take community as something that is multi-layered, fluid, intersectional, and ultimately context-specific. I guess in particular, we're looking at the changing relational dynamics that individual community members have, be it with the Syrian government, with other governance actors, and members of other communities. So I think that gives a flavour of our approach.
Yeah, great. Thank you, Thomas. So, I mean, that gives us a better understanding of some of the concepts and also theoretical underpinnings and assumptions that you base your research on. And from here, maybe I want to delve into the first of the 5 case studies that you present in the report. And maybe let's stay with you, Thomas. How does what has just been said play out in the case of Afrin? What are the main developments and findings you can draw from this case?
Okay, so the Afrin case study is quite a compelling example of how conflict-induced displacement has led to increased communal and intercommunal tensions. So Afrin is an area in the northwest of Syria. It's historically a Kurdish majority area, and what we've seen there is that huge displacement into the area has led to a lot of tensions, primarily around issues of housing, land and property rights, and it's led to disputes and various violations. I think it's important to recognize that displacement has been a huge phenomenon across Syria, and it has sometimes led to positive developments for communities. So sometimes communities who've lived at quite a distance from each other have been able to get to know each other. Where that's different in Afrin is that after 2018, when there was essentially a Turkish-backed military campaign against Afrin, there was a huge orchestrated population movement. So this happens to be at the same time that territories around rural Damascus were falling out of opposition control. So it essentially resulted in a large population exchange. So a lot of primarily Arab IDPs from rural Damascus and elsewhere in Syria were being brought to this historically Kurdish majority area of Afrin. This has resulted in very strong identitarian and sectarian framings of the housing, land and property issues. There, of course, housing, land and property violations are everywhere during a conflict, but there's been a very pronounced identitarian dimension within Afrin. So that's also coincided with various other policies. In the background, there's been a dekurdification policy pushed forward by some of the Syrian actors on the ground and their Turkish backers. So this includes various kidnap campaigns, but also a dekurdification of linguistic terms, of street names, etc. And there's been a strong Turkification of the educational curriculum. So these things coinciding have meant that it's very strongly felt that original Kurdish inhabitants are the victims of housing, land and property violations, while Arabs who've moved into the area are the perpetrators. In general, there's been quite a lot of work done on this issue, but it's nearly always taken the perspective of focusing on the armed factions, the Syrian armed factions and their Turkish backers as the main perpetrators. And indeed, they are the main perpetrators of most of these violations. But what we really wanted to focus on with this case is to look at the role and situation of individual internally displaced people. So we've seen that sometimes they are complicit in these violations, primarily through associations with the armed factions, be it through family or other connections. But then sometimes they just find themselves left with no other choice in a very uncomfortable situation where they ultimately have to live somewhere, and that often means that they have to occupy somebody else's home. So this case enabled us to look at solutions, and what we saw is that the formal solutions very much failed to address this issue effectively. So specifically, there was an entity known as the Grievance Redress Committee that was established to address housing, land and property issues in Afrin. It was established by lawyers and bureaucrats from the Turkish-supported actors. Ultimately, chaos on the ground and the impunity of the armed groups meant it couldn't really fulfill its role, and it's dissolved. What we then seen instead is that more ad hoc initiatives have actually been quite effective. So this includes a group of activists on the ground from Eastern Ghouta and rural Damascus who were communicating between original Kurdish inhabitants and Arab IDP families over WhatsApp. They recognized these are not contracts, nothing is legally binding, but they felt that having at least some understanding is, to quote one of these individuals, a slightly more ethical solution. So in general, this case highlights the importance of balance when it comes to interventions. That yes, we need to promote social cohesion and peaceful coexistence, but it's also necessary to address fundamental human rights that have been violated at the same time. So that's a quick summary of the Afrin case. Thank you.
Thank you, Thomas, for your insights. Let's now look at the cases of the Druze community in Sweden and the tribes in Deir ez-Zor. That would be your expertise, Haian. So both of these cases respond to very timely episodes of tensions and an uprising in the case of Sweden's Druze community that draw attention to communal concerns, basically. So how do we make sense of these cases? And on another level, how could European policymakers better navigate them to achieve peace formation?
Thank you so much, Anne. So the case study of Sweden looks at this dramatic shift really in the Druze community position in Sweden and try to look at the factors beyond the economic factor that is often talked about in the news and media analysis that led to the Druze protest in Sweden against the government of Syria. So it starts by looking at the issue of neutrality, how the Druze community in Sweden maintained a neutral position throughout the Syrian revolution, since the beginning of the Syrian revolution, really, because they perceive the government more or less as a protector of the minorities against Islamist threats. And this perception was rooted in historical experiences, according to the interviews that I have conducted with people or members of the Druze community in Sweden, where they talked about kind of the past suppression at the hands of previous leaders of Syria as well. So we're talking here about issues of collective memory that made them become neutral for a long period during the Syrian uprising. So it starts by looking at the economic motives. Obviously, the current protest movement was significantly driven by the economic hardship, mainly by the Syrian government decision to eliminate fuel subsidies, which led to 140% increase in prices, which affected the agricultural sector in Sweden, because the community in Sweden is highly dependent on the agriculture. And from conversation and interviews as well with members of the Druze community, they talked about how desertification is spreading in the area and how they cannot really afford to look after their farms, which had a really negative impact on their income. The second factor that the paper looks as well at is security failure, the fact that the trust in the Syrian government eroded after the 2018 ISIS attack on Sweden, which led to high number of casualties among the Druze community. And so the regime failure to protect the Druze contributed to a profound sense of insecurity and betrayal as well among the community, when they thought that the regime is the protector of the minorities, but at the same time they kind of saw that the regime has not been able to protect them from um, ISIS or other Islamist groups. At the same time, we saw in Sweden over the past few years the assassination of Sheikh Wahid al-Balous, who is a Druze figure who established kind of some sort of a militia to protect the Druze from external threats there. And he was assassinated, and many people kind of blamed the regime on that. He led a militia that was called the Rijal of Karama, and he was replaced more or less by criminal gangs and drug traffickers as well in the region. And these fears have, among the Druze community, have destabilized the region, with warlords exploiting the situation and exasperating communities' grievances. The case study looked at the issue of military conscription as well. So how the government enforcement of military conscription among the Druze youths created significant unrest, because for most of the time of the Syrian revolution or the Syrian uprising, or whatever we want to use to describe the events, the Druze have been exempted really from going to the military service. But then the Syrian government reached a stage where it started to ask these people to go to the military service. So there was fear of arrest as well and forced conscription that prevented large number of them from engaging in normal societal activities. And from the interviews that we have conducted with people who live in Sueda, they talked about the fact that they can't go to university, they can't go to any government offices as a result of that. So this contributed to the feeling of being trapped in Sueda and not being able to leave the area. And large number of these military service evaders basically provided, let's say, a large pool of contributors to the protest movement that is taking place in Sueda. A very important factor as well that this case study looks at is the role of Druze spiritual leaders, particularly Sheikh Hikmat al-Hijri, who announced publicly his support for the protesters and his public criticism of the government policies. And his public statements played a major role in galvanizing the communities against the regime. And his shift from cautious support for the regime to active opposition highlights significant change in the community's leadership. And this, in turn, legitimized as well the protest movement. It made those who were on the sidelines or were hesitant to join the protest movement join the protest movement. So the case study shows that the civil society has been crucial in maintaining the protest movement as well. Local activists and groups like You Smothered Us, Khanaftuna, have led non-violent protests as well, raised awareness and sought international solidarity through cultural activities that the case study talks about. They have organized events showcasing their heritage, used symbolic messaging as well to draw global attention, and they initiated community-driven projects like pop-up libraries during the protest movement as well. So moving to the second case study here, the second case study of Deir ez-Zor tries to explain the reasons for the recent escalations between the Arab tribes and the self-administration in Deir ez-Zor, and tries to look at the Arab tribes' grievances against the self-administration and the role of external actors in exasperating the local tensions. So looking at these grievances, we can see economic grievances that particularly revolve around the distribution of the profits from the oil in the region that exist in Deir ez-Zor. So many members of the tribe feel that they are not benefiting really from the oil resources that exist in their region. They feel that the process of decision-making is monopolized as well by Kurdish advisors who came from Al-Hasaka, and they live in Deir ez-Zor as well. The case study looked at the regime exploitation of tribal identity and how the regime is hosting many tribal leaders who are leading the insurgency against the self-administration. And the purpose of that is trying to put pressure on the self-administration and on the Americans as well to withdraw from Deir ez-Zor. The case study highlights that the self-administration is currently facing dual threats from ISIS sleeper cells and from the Syrian regime sleeper cells at the same time. The case study looks at the issue of a fragmented tribal leadership, how tribal leadership in Deir ez-Zor is contested, and how this fragmentation is actually complicating the efforts to establish stable governance and effective peace formation, and how the external actors, including the regime and other regional powers, are manipulating these internal dynamics to further their agendas in Deir ez-Zor. So the case study concludes by looking at the tribal initiatives for peace formation in Deir ez-Zor, and or focuses particularly at the example of Sheikh Hajim al-Bashir, who is the leader of the Baggara tribe, and how he's been trying to hold regular meetings between members of the Hawiati tribe that is mainly taking part in the insurgency against the SDF, and between the self-administration. The case study looks at how Sheikh Hajim al-Bashir has mediated between the self-administration and the Hawiati tribe, trying to convey the demands as well, such as the release of the Arab prisoners and the improvement of public services. In terms of recommendation that this kind of the two case studies makes here, it looks at the issue of inclusive governance, how policymakers should advocate for including Suwayda communities' perspective and priorities in any international peace negotiations and any future reconstruction plan as well, if they were to happen in the future, ensuring as well that the voices of Suwayda communities are heard and that their interests are represented, and promoting inclusive governance in Deir ez-Zor that represents diverse ethnic, religious, and tribal groups. The case study looks at or recommends policymakers to engage as well with the Druze religious leaders and opposition figures as well in Suwayda, and engage with leaders in Deir ez-Zor, tribal leaders, but recognizing at the same time, which is something that the case study highlights, that the legitimacy and the authority of tribal leaders is contested. It recommends as well policymakers to support initiatives in Suwayda that enhance local community stability and resilience, and support initiatives in Deir ez-Zor that enhance local economic opportunities, and implement security measures that to protect all communities regardless of their ethnicity.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you, Haian, for your insights and description of two very complex and multi-layered cases, which actually they all are. So we have two cases left. Rana worked on those, namely, you have looked at Syrian Christian communities as well as the situation of Idlib's Sunni community. And while these cases are obviously of very different nature, they both give prominence to the role played by peace formation agents in countering sectarianization and violence. Can you tell us a bit more about the role of these actors in each case? And again, I want to tie back immediately to the policy level and recommendations that arise from these case studies for European policymakers that are looking to enable such peace formation agency.
Sure, Anne. So if we look at these two cases, we think there's nothing in common between them. The Christians are dispersed across Syria, whereas the Sunni, Idlib Sunni Arab community have been, even the IDPs, Idlib has become the stronghold of the opposition there, and of course the economic the situation it's much more difficult there, and we see the rise of a very totally different form of governance under the HTS Salvation government in Idlib. But if we look more closely, we see that wherever there is power, especially when this power is oppressive, you have resistance to it. And this resistance has taken the form of this invisible peace formation agency. If we look at the case of the Christians, usually the Christians are portrayed as, the vulnerable victims to the conflict in Syria, but they have been, yes, Christians have been, victims of violence, but they have been, in a way, perpetrators of violence, be it by joining military groups, which is less heard of aspect, even though it's much less than any other group, and a very small minority of them has, and in their association with the government of Syria. But why is this the case? And just to understand how this peace formation agency operated, we need to understand the context of, you know, the Christian fears and what happened. What is it that pushes the Christians towards the government of Syria in this manner, even though nowadays actually we see a lot of displeasure with what's happening. Something might be boiling, maybe something similar to Sweden, but it would be much more difficult because the Christians are more dispersed. So historically, the idea of majority and minority was introduced by colonial powers. This separation and the differentiation between the ethnic groups started with the Ottoman Empire, but it was actually codified by the French. And this is when we start, because the French wanted to weaken the Sunni notables of the community, and so they started trading with the Christians, empowering the Christians, creating schools for the Christians, and they started creating those differences between the different communities. And then we had the famous personal status law that strongly codifies it. And then we see incidents of violations against the Christians, like before and after World War I. One of them is the Armenian genocide by Turkey, and some Kurdish forces have joined in. And this has implication for later, for the frictions again in Al-Hasaki between Christians and Kurds partly. And then we see jihadist violence and in the Riyadh in Damascus, and the Muslim Brotherhood uprising in the 80s. And then regionally, we see what Christians always look at what happened in Egypt and in Iraq, and they keep on feeling that a lot of them feel that they have no future in the Middle East because of this victimization. Of course, when generations are exchanging stories, they rarely mention, you know, the positive stories when they were protected by the other, when they, you know, all these. So it's usually this, and part of why this victimization was repeated over and over, it's because the government of Syria has capitalized on it and presented itself as the protector of Christians, and it has actually used Christian gatekeepers, which is church leaders and Christian businessmen, as gatekeepers, you know, who had, there's a particular church government relationship, a status quo that they need to maintain. So they actually were disseminating the narrative of the regime that the Christians are under a direct threat. Now, this actually would increase with regional actors increasing the sectarian rhetoric. This was becoming more difficult for the Christians not to feel a security dilemma. Do we side here or do we side with the other, especially when there were actually incidents of sectarianism against Christians, not to the level that we saw in Iraq or Lebanon. But still, I mean, this did have serious implications on them, leading some to take up arms. So what did this peace formation try to do? They tried to counter sectarianism. It came in many forms. So we see at the early on in 2011, a group of just Christian youth tried to create advocacy with the church leader not to take sides. We see Christians taking solidarity with a lot of their neighbors, their Muslim neighbors, going to funerals, and this is a very big act of solidarity in Syria. Providing aid to besieged areas because Christians had easier access to these areas, given that the regime would discriminate a little less against them. And then negotiating and creating dialogue with state and not state actors. And we see this with individual leadership, be it Father Ibrahim, Paulo, which led to their death, actually, or to their abductions by one of the conflicting parties, be it the government of Syria or other actors. So just because this agency is hardly unheard of, because it had to operate in the shadows. But what we can do here is try to support these kind of acts of solidarity. There's no one or two sides or groups to support. It's more of an agency, which takes us to the case of the Sunni Arabs in Idlib. And again, we see at the beginning of the revolution, and we see a group of teachers mobilize themselves to create and to continue to provide education for Sunni Arabs in Idlib. That was actually a bit of it, taking on a lot of IDPs from other regions in the country. And they started it. The only thing they did use the institutions and the curriculum they inherited from the government of Syria, just removing the Ba'athist curriculum. But soon, with the takeover of the HTS, and the HTS, of course, is trying to ideologize the community and to legitimize itself as such, we start seeing education as a very politically contested issue. From one side, the HTS is the de facto authority on the ground. It can control. It has the power and the military arm. But then on the other side, we see the Syrian interim government. It accredits education, and donors decide to work with it because it's it's not ideologized like the HTS. But then we see this friction between the two, and both of them claim that the IDE is ours, whereas the teachers who formed it say that we are a technocratic group, and all we want is, to serve the locals based on they see a future for the locals there. They don't want a lost generation to violence. So they don't want to identify with either side because the Syrian interim government is politicized as well. So we see this friction. Now, what do donors do? So donors do not want to engage with the IDE, and sometimes the IDE has tried to, the HTS tried to infiltrate the IDE, with recruitment and appointments. So donors lift up their hands as usual, and we don't deal with these groups, and this usually harms the local community because what do you end up? Even the HTS, there's an opportunity there where they did highlight that they're leaving the education and health to local group to take care of simply because they cannot fund it and because they want to legitimize themselves. So why not take this opportunity? Still be aware of what's happening on the ground, but again, like in the Christian case, what we would recommend is look at these relations of power and be reflective of what's happening on the ground and do back those agencies, because this is the only thing that's the only opportunity that we can afford at the moment. So it's like our recommendation goes back again to looking at the power relationships. Look at these actors in relations to what's happening on the ground. How can you support an education system rather than fragmented NGOs supporting civil society groups here and there? Because in the end of the day, you don't want to continue focusing on remedial education. There's a serious problem with the teachers' salaries. So yeah, the recommendation would go similarly for both. Like, find those agents and try to back them technically, financially, and even in terms of capacity.
Thank you, Rana, and thank you to the three of you for presenting these 5 very interesting case studies. I think they show how complex it is and that one policy might work in one area but might not in another. It's very context specific. Nevertheless, I think you also found some overarching recommendations, especially when it comes to this formulation of sustainable policies towards peace formation. Maybe Haian, could you give us, first of all, a quick snapshot about constraints and challenges that local communities are facing towards peace formation and how these can be navigated towards policy recommendations?
Of course, yeah, thank you. So there are actually 3 set of constraints that I'm going to talk about here. First, we have constraints coming from or as a result of contested governance. We have resource contestation and capture, where both state and non-state actors compete over resources to enhance their legitimacy. And this competition often leads to intercommunal tensions and divisions. For example, competition over oil resources in their zone causes tribal clashes, and then later intervention by external actors deepen this competition. For example, the self-administration's control over these resources led to further tensions, as we have seen in the case of Deir ez-Zor, due to perceived unequal distribution of wealth. And we have, secondly, historic constraints that have been deepened. Many of these local communities have experienced continuation of pre-existing grievances. For example, tribal grievances in Deir ez-Zor that are linked to the historical marginalization and the lack of benefits from the oil resources have been deepened, and the obviously kind of the control of the self-administration has added an ethnic dimension to these grievances. The third challenge here is security dilemmas, how communities face these security dilemmas that are often viewed with the lens that other communities are threats to them. And this leads to increased militarization and affiliation as well with armed groups in order to protect and control the resources. Some subsection of the Christian communities, for example, as we have seen in the report, have engaged in militant sectarianism to provide protection, aligning with various powers such as the Syrian regime or the Kurdish forces. Now we have constraints as well that are imposed by external actors. We have seen in this report competitive regional intervention, how regional and international interventions are empowering identity-based governance forces. And this is reshaping the dynamics of Syrian tribal, religious, and ethnic communities, and how these interventions advanced sometimes, or in many cases, unfortunately, sectarian rhetoric, militarization, and resource control as well. We have finally internal community constraints. These include communal fragmentation. Local communities face internal divisions that are exacerbated by external influence and the capture of resource by governance actors. For example, the lawlessness and the warlordism linked to the Syrian regime networks in Suwayda have intensified the fragmentation within the community between those who collaborate with the regime and those who oppose the regime. And the result, obviously, of all of that is the militarization and the securitization of identity, where the affiliation with armed groups have led to increased communal tensions and militarization. We have seen with the different groups that have formed their own militias as well. So policymakers, to deal with these challenges, need to promote fair and transparent resource distribution. They should also encourage inclusive decision-making process that involve all community stakeholders and support initiatives that monitor and address the grievances, because if we don't deal with the root grievances of the conflict, then dealing with the surface or of the problem will not solve it. Supporting local communities as well who advocate for fair governance and resource distribution. And finally, supporting initiatives that bridge the divides within the communities, such as intercommunal projects and dialogues, and demilitarization and promoting civilian protection.
Thank you. Haian, you have already touched upon a bit how policymakers can help overcome these constraints that local communities are facing. I want to give also Thomas and Rana the chance to add their input, whoever wants to start first.
Sure, maybe I can come in with some sort of just quite general remarks. So in addition to the case-specific recommendations that we've touched on a little bit earlier, the report actually includes a whole series of more overarching recommendations. Some of those are sector and, again, context-specific, and we would encourage anyone interested, particularly people working in policy, to take a closer look at the report and the briefing paper. Now, I'm not going to go into listing. I think we have something like 27 recommendations, but rather I'll try and summarize the general logic that's underpinned how we came to some of these recommendations and how we're framing them. So ultimately, the key principle and priority for us has really been looking at how to amplify counter-sectarian voices and to build the agency for peace formation within communities that's often already existing. And one thing that we focus on is the need for a balance in terms of the international community needing to put pressure on representation of all communities within political initiatives, within governance structures, but also within those communities to ensure that there is participation, so that we don't end up in a situation where there are particular gatekeepers being supported to represent the community, sometimes for their own interests and not necessarily the community's benefit. Just building on what Haian was talking about with the root grievances, in many cases, we have to go back even before the conflict. So to look at pre-conflict grievances that have sometimes existed, and these can relate to the government of Syria, but also to between communities. So it's really important to look at how sometimes those pre-existing grievances are being compounded by the conflict. And then ultimately there are questions about, we look at how to potentially intervene, and then also with whom to consider interventions. And I think maybe Rana has focused on that section.
So yes, thanks, Thomas. And I'll actually jump even further with the question, and I know you'd have this in mind. How do we operationalize this? And just to build on what Thomas was saying, who do we deal with? How do we make these recommendations practical? Yes, we looked at the local actors, we looked at the historic issues, we looked at the question of rules and resources and how do they play out, external actors, governance actors, but how do you operationalize this? And our main recommendations is find those peace formation agents, include local voices and perspectives that seek to serve the local, not those governing. Look beyond just, the civil society organizations that we like, the English-speaking elitist ones, dig further, like engage with teachers, activists, religious leaders, and it depends on the agency. Some religious leaders can do more harm than good, but others can actually have this positive agency. Now, how do we engage? And our first recommendation here would take a relational approach to things, understand how these actors are situated within their own context, how they connect to the governing forces, to the international actors, to the local community. How much are they integrated within the local community? And continuously adapt. I mean, yes, it's easier to just make up one policy and put it and, sleep over it for 2 years and come back to it. But just because this context is very fluid, we need to continuously be reflective, and while still tailoring it to the specificity of each community, but without essentializing them. Partner long-term with those agents, create relationships of trust, enable their resources and ensure that, promote locally driven solutions, whilst also advocating freedom of expression, association, and assembly. But beware of, I know you would tell us that, yes, we have all these localization agendas, but the problem, these are not working on the ground. And one reason is this essentialization of community and the fact that these interventions have been used, to minimize for budget reasons. Just when an international NGO decides that, we no longer have the funds, we'll give it to our local partner, and then things don't work out. It's just because the whole idea of localization to some of the organization has been, we have our own frameworks in mind and projects, and let the local implement them. So let's not move localization into this direction and keep it at the peace formation level. Now, Now, this solution is not without, let's not over-romanticize local solutions either. They're not without their problems. It would challenge policy coherence. We do understand this, you know, while one policy will work in one area, it will not. That is challenging. We do understand this. It's difficult to find, you know, those invisible agents. Community representation would remain contentious. And you know, when it could, you know, these agents could shift in agency sometimes. So sometimes, you know, working with a certain tribal member might be beneficial for the time being for this specific cause, but sometimes they shift agency. So we just need to be always keeping up with these things. But this doesn't mean just because they don't look like, you know, the perfect, easy, you know, organizations we like to deal of, to take our hands off them. It's because they've been proven to decrease violence and dampen conflict during periods of escalations. It's easy to see where, you know, who escalated conflicts, but it's very hard to see who de-escalated it. And then they're locally relevant and sustainable for the future. They will have, you know, deep-rooted relations with the community, and they can, you know, this is what ensures they building on pre-existing relations, networks, and grassroots initiatives. And this is what ensures that, you know, peace for the future. Thank you.
Thank you so much. I think, well, this basically opportunities you've just pointed us towards for policymakers, for peace formation agents. Like, I think this report shows that there is a lot of constraints, or at least things to consider, and policymakers need to look very, very carefully. But if they do, and if there is a collaboration, then there is opportunities going this path forward. I think that's a good note for now to end our conversation. Thank you so much to all of you for your very thoughtful input and sharing your insights, your expertise, and as well, thank you for the very comprehensive and very insightful report, which we will link in the description of this YouTube video, as well as the policy brief which arose from the report. And well, thank you so much for everyone who joined us.
Yeah.
Thanks to you, Anne, and to Cass.